In more than 4 decades, Laurence Fishburne has lived two parallel lives that almost no one has realized. A man on screen, always steady, wise, as if he understood every answer in the world, and a human being in real life quietly facing gaps that could not be filled. He grew up without the figure of a father to look up to, entered the entertainment industry when he was too young to understand everything he had to endure, and from then on learned how to stand firm without anyone holding his hand. The years working in an adult environment took away his innocence, replacing it with a shell of almost absolute emotional control. No one saw those long nights when he had to face himself, with questions that had no answers, with wounds he did not allow himself to show. When family crises happened, when the choices of his loved ones went beyond control, he did not react loudly, did not try to explain, but chose silence as silence, not because he felt nothing, but because he had gotten used to enduring alone. Living two lives was not a choice, but something he was forced to accept, one who guided others and one who was still struggling to find his own way. But in either life, he had never allowed himself to collapse. But precisely from that endurance, Laurence Fishburne has built a career that not many people can reach, starting from small roles until he made his name with Boyz in the Hood, then exploded with the role of Ike Turner in What's Love Got to Do with It, bringing home an Oscar nomination for Best Leading Actor and a series of praises from critics. He continued to affirm his position with the role of Morpheus in The Matrix, one of the most iconic characters of modern cinema, making his name a global symbol of wisdom and strength. Not stopping at film, he also won a Tony Award for the stage with Two Trains Running, an Emmy for television acting, and became one of the few artists recognized in all three major fields of performing arts. He continued to maintain his influence through projects like CSI, Crime Scene Investigation, and the John Wick film series, where he brought deep and powerful characters. More than 40 years in the industry, Laurence Fishburne is not only a successful actor, but also a cultural icon, a person who has paved the way for many generations of black artists in Hollywood, proving that true strength does not lie in never feeling pain, but in continuing to move forward while carrying all the cracks inside. Before stepping further into the story behind that mask, please hit like and leave a heart. That is a small way to send understanding to a man who has learned to endure in silence throughout his life. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel, because what you are about to see is not only the truth about Laurence Fishburne, but the journey of a person who had to find his own way through the darkness of himself. Born in the summer of 2061, Laurence Fishburne entered the world not in a complete warm home, but in a family that had already begun to crack before he could understand what connection meant. His father left when he was too young, so early that memories of a man called father almost did not exist. No afternoons holding hands, no teachings, not even memories clear enough to recall. What remained was only a vague emptiness, a feeling of lack without a specific shape, but big enough to follow him for the rest of his life. People often say that children do not realize what they do not have, but with Laurence, that feeling was not realization, but a silent absence that crept into every day of life, like a question without words that he did not know who to ask. His mother, a strong and responsible woman, did everything she could to raise her son in not easy circumstances. She was strict, disciplined, and always demanded from him maturity earlier than his age. But in that effort, what Laurence received was not gentleness, but direction, not embracing arms, but expectations that had to be met. She did not have much time to stop, to ask her son how he felt, because life did not allow her to be weak, and unintentionally, that also did not allow Laurence to be weak. From the early years of life, he learned a lesson that no one taught with words. If no one was there to listen, then it was better not to speak out. And so, a child began to learn how to be silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because he did not believe anyone really wanted to hear. In small rooms, in long afternoons without conversation, Laurence gradually got used to playing alone, thinking alone, facing emotions that he was not old enough to name, without a hand placed on his shoulder to reassure, without a gentle voice to say that everything would be okay. He grew up with a feeling that this world was a place where he had to learn how to exist on his own. When other children turned to their parents for protection, Laurence only had himself. And gradually, he no longer sought that. The first feeling he truly understood about life was not joy or curiosity, but a quiet realization that he was not protected like others. That did not make him collapse, but it changed him. He became more observant, spoke less, and always kept an invisible distance from the world around him. Relationships became more difficult, not because he did not want to connect, but because he had never been taught how to do it. The absence of a father was not just missing a person, but missing a role model, a direction, a sense of security that should have existed. And when that was not there, a child was forced to create structure for himself, to build his own way, to stand firm, even when inside there were still many things he did not understand. Laurence was not a rebellious child, nor a loud child seeking attention. He was the type of person others easily overlooked, always there, but not making any noise loud enough to be noticed. And precisely in that silence, a person began to form, strong on the outside, but carrying gaps that no one saw. When he entered his teenage years, those deficiencies did not disappear, but only changed form. They became the motivation for him to seek a place where he could exist more fully, a place where his voice could be heard. And it was at that moment that acting appeared, not as a big dream, but as a quiet escape. On stage, he could become someone else, say things he did not say in life, express emotions he had learned to hide. It was not just a job, but a way to compensate for what he had never had. But even when he found that path, the loneliness did not disappear. It only became more subtle, deeper, and harder to recognize, because a child who grew up without being embraced would not easily learn to believe that he deserved to be loved. And even if later the world saw him as a symbol, a strong and respectable man, somewhere deep inside, there still existed the shadow of that little boy standing in silence, not crying, not calling anyone's name, simply accepting that he had to grow up on his own without anyone really there to hold him. Not long after learning how to be silent in order to survive, the young boy Laurence Fishburne stepped into a world where silence was no longer a choice, but became a tool to adapt, to please, to not be left behind. While other children were still struggling with simple games, Laurence had already begun standing in front of the camera, learning how to say lines that were not his own, learning how to express emotions he had never truly experienced. Acting came to him not like a chosen dream, but like a path that opened too early, a way he stepped into before he had time to understand that he was leaving his childhood behind. And when that door closed behind him, there was no one there to bring him back. The days on the film set were nothing like anything a child should go through. It was a place for adults, with dense schedules, with hot, bright lights and continuous judging eyes. There was no room for confusion, no space for weakness, and certainly no one stopped to ask a boy whether he felt scared or not. Laurence learned how to stand still when asked, to speak when called, and to disappear when no longer needed. He became part of the machine, a performer, not a child growing up. And then, when he was not old enough to understand the world around him, he stepped into an experience that even adults could hardly endure, the movie Apocalypse Now. To be in that project, Laurence had to lie about his age, a decision that perhaps came from the desire to be recognized, or simply from not wanting to be left behind. But the price of that choice was something no one really explained to him. The film set was not just a place to shoot a movie, but a space of chaos, tension, full of extreme emotions that a child was not prepared to face. Stories about war, about death, about human madness were no longer distant concepts, but became part of the environment he had to live in every day. no one said that it was too much for a boy, because in their eyes, Laurence was no longer a child. He was an actor. And that was enough. The long days on set stretched not only in time, but also psychologically. He learned how not to react, learned how to keep everything inside, learned how to continue even when he did not understand why he was there. And gradually, the boundary between acting and existing began to blur. Laurence was not only playing a role. He began to live in a state where real emotions were pushed back, giving way to what was necessary to complete the job. No one asked if he was ready for that, because in that world, a child's readiness was not what mattered. What mattered was that the scene had to be finished, the lines had to be correct, and the story had to be told. And so, as each day passed, a part of childhood that should have been lived quietly disappeared, without noise, without leaving clear traces, but enough to create a gap that nothing later could fill. When the movie ended, Laurence did not return as a normal child, because he had never had the chance to become such a child. Instead, he carried experiences that should have belonged to adults, memories he was not old enough to understand, and a way of existing that he had learned, if you want to continue, just act, not only on screen, but in his own life. He acted strong when he felt weak, acted certain when inside he was full of doubt, acted calm when everything became too much. And over time, acting was no longer a conscious act, but became instinct. That was how he survived in a world that had never really stopped to ask what he needed. And perhaps, among all the roles Laurence Fishburne had ever played, the longest, hardest, and least recognized role was precisely the role of a child forced to grow up before he had time to understand what it meant to live like a child. After leaving the teenage years swept into the harsh cycle of the film set, Laurence Fishburne entered a stage where he should have begun to find his place in the world. But instead, he gradually realized that he was standing on the edge of the very place he had spent his youth pursuing. The early years of his adult career did not bring him recognition, nor did they open big doors as people might imagine for a child actor who had been in Apocalypse Now. On the contrary, he became a name that quietly passed among hundreds of other faces, not prominent enough to be noticed, but not disappearing completely to start over from the beginning. Hollywood at that time was a place that demanded perfection according to a very specific mold: appearance, temperament, personal story, and Laurence Fishburne, with his non-typical look, with inner depth more than glamour, seemed not to belong to any of those molds. He was not the type of star who could easily be marketed, not the model that studios wanted to put on posters and that put him in a position few recognized, always present but rarely seen. The roles that came to him in this period were often small, unstable, and sometimes more substitute than choice. He works not because he was sought after, but because he had no other choice but to continue. And in each project, each scene, he poured everything he had into it. Not to shine immediately, but just to prove he deserved to stay. But recognition did not come quickly like that. There were days he walked out of the film set with no one remembering his name. There were times he read cold comments from people who had never truly seen him as an independent individual. And in those moments, the feeling of being forgotten was no longer a passing thought, but became a familiar state. The most painful thing was not clear failure, but existing in a gray area where no one cared enough to reject you, but no one trusted enough to give you a real opportunity. Laurence did not react with anger, nor did he try to attract attention in any way. He returned to what he had learned very early: silence. Silence was no longer just a reaction, but became a shell, a way to keep himself from being hurt more. He observed more, spoke less, and gradually withdrew himself from connections he felt he did not belong to. In meetings, in conversations, he was present but not really participating, as if part of him always stood outside, looking into his own life. That separation did not happen in one moment, but formed through each small experience, each time being overlooked, each opportunity that did not come, each glance that did not linger long enough, and over time it became part of who he was. He no longer expected to be understood, no longer sought recognition from places that had disappointed him many times. Instead, he began to build his own world inside himself, a place where he could control, where he could exist without having to meet external standards. But the price of that self-protection was isolation. Laurence still worked, still appeared, still continued the journey he had started since he was a child. But there was an increasingly clear distance between him and the world around him. He no longer tried to become part of the system, but only tried to exist in it in the least hurtful way possible. And precisely in this seemingly faint period, something important was happening. He was becoming himself, not the version Hollywood wanted, but the person formed from everything he had been through. Absence, pressure, silence, and a persistent will that was not easily seen. But at that time, no one called it strength. To them, he was just an actor who had not really succeeded, a face not prominent enough, a name that could easily be replaced, and perhaps precisely that evaluation, precisely being placed outside the spotlight, had unintentionally pushed Laurence Fishburne onto a path he had not planned, a path where he no longer sought recognition from the outside, but began to build his value from within. However, that path was not easy at all, because to accept that one is not seen, a person must learn to live without needing recognition, and that is a lesson not everyone has the strength to endure. For Laurence, it was not just a stage in his career, but a part that shaped the man he later became. A man who could stand in the light, but still carried the feeling of someone who had once been forgotten in the shadows. From that feeling of being placed on the sidelines, Laurence Fishburne did not leave the game, but he also no longer walked with the innocence of someone who believed that just effort was enough to be seen. He continued to work, taking each small role, opportunities that came and went without leaving clear traces, as if he was talking to a world that never really listened to him. There were no big lights, no long rounds of applause, only quiet working days, auditions where the results always hung in the balance, and a familiar feeling that he was still not enough. But what was different about Laurence was that he did not stop. Not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he did not allow himself to fail. For him, failure was not just losing a role or an opportunity, but confirming all the doubts the world had once placed on him, that he did not belong here, that he was just a background voice, a presence that could be replaced. And so he fought, not in big moments that people could easily see, but in the smallest details of the work, the way he read a line, the way he held a gaze, the way he stepped into a scene as if it was his last chance. People who worked with him began to notice something different, a focus that was almost absolute, an approach that was not loud but full of determination. He did not try to attract attention, but when he appeared, no one could completely ignore him, and gradually, little by little, he began to create a space for himself, not through explosion, but through persistence, to the point that it could not be denied. But the battle Laurence Fishburne had to face was not only about being recognized as an actor, as a black man in an industry that already had strict standards and deep prejudices. He also carried another pressure, the pressure to represent. Each role was not just a personal opportunity, but also an image through which an entire community could be judged. He not only needed to act well, but also to be right, to be enough, to not leave any reason to be taken lightly. That was a burden not everyone saw, but it was always present in every decision he made. There were roles he refused not because they were not big enough, but because they did not reflect correctly the person he believed needed to be shown. But refusing also meant accepting the loss of rare opportunities at a time when he still did not have a solid position. And so, every step became more difficult. Every choice carried greater risk. He did not have the right to make many mistakes, no buffer to try and fail like many others. For Laurence, everything was decisive, even when the world around him did not realize it. There were nights he returned after a long day, with nothing to prove that he had taken one more step, but also nothing to allow him to stop. He sat alone with thoughts that were not easy to name. In a city that was always moving but seemed to have no place for people like him, in those moments doubt did not disappear. It only became more familiar. He wondered if he was pursuing something that did not belong to him, if all these efforts would lead anywhere or not. But then, the next morning, he continued. Not because he had found the answer, but because he was not ready to give up the question. And precisely in that repetition, in continuing even when there was no guarantee, a strength began to form, a strength that was not loud, not showy, but enough to keep him standing firm. The years passed, with no single moment that could be called a clear turning point, but rather a series of small advances, accumulating gradually, until no one could deny that Laurence Fishburne was no longer just a background voice. He began to be given roles with more depth, characters that demanded more about the inner world, where everything he had been through, the silence, the observation, the gaps, became a valuable asset. He did not need to try to create depth, because he had lived with it for too long. And when the real opportunity came, he did not have to learn how to seize it, but simply became himself. But what few people understood was that even when he began to be recognized, the battle inside him did not end, because, after all those years, he was no longer fighting just to be seen, but also to believe that he deserved to be seen. And that was a battle that lasted longer, was more difficult, and almost never really ended. And then, after many years of walking in silence, the moment that people called success finally came to Laurence Fishburne. But it did not come like a big explosion, but like a door opening slowly, almost without making a sound, making even him unsure whether he had really stepped through or not. When he appeared in Boyz in the Hood, audiences began to see something they had missed before, a steady presence, a depth that did not need to be shown off. A man who could carry the full weight of the story just by standing still and speaking truthfully. That role was not just a step forward in his career, but also an affirmation that Laurence Fishburne was no longer a faint name. But even when the praises began to appear, even when he was looked upon with the respect he had pursued for many years, the feeling inside him did not change in the way people usually imagined. There was no moment of enlightenment, no feeling of, finally I have arrived. There was only a continuation, as if he was still on the same old path, only the lights around had become a little brighter. Then came What's Love Got to Do with It? The role of Ike Turner, a complex character, full of contradictions and darkness, that brought Laurence closer to what the entire industry could not ignore. He did not just act, he dug deep into the dark corners of human nature, bringing to the screen a truth that was not easy to look at, not easy to accept. And this time, the world responded more clearly. An Oscar nomination for Best Leading Actor, a recognition at the highest level an actor could achieve. That was the moment many people dreamed of, the destination that not a few people spent their whole lives pursuing. But for Laurence, it did not bring a feeling of completion. When his name was called in the nomination list, when the stage lights shone on him as one of the best, he did not feel he had arrived, because deep inside, there was still a gap that could not be named a part of him. Was still that boy from back then, standing on the sidelines, wondering if he really belonged here or not. People saw him on the red carpet, in neat suits, with the calmness they had become familiar with, and they believed he was living in the glorious moment of his life. But they did not see the silences afterward. When he returned to the room, when the noise of the event had died down, when only he remained with thoughts that no one else heard. Success, for many people, is a destination, but for Laurence Fishburne, it was like a layer of light shining on the surface, while what was underneath still did not change. He was still the man who had learned how to be silent in order to survive, Still the person who did not easily believe he deserved what he had achieved. Still the person carrying gaps from the past that no title could fill. After the Oscar nomination, more doors opened. He began to receive bigger roles, projects with wider influence, and his name gradually became familiar to the public. But each step forward did not reduce the pressure on. The contrary, it made the burden even clearer, because now he not only needed to maintain what he had achieved, but also had to prove that it was not a random moment. He had to continue, had to be better, had to be deeper, had to not let himself fall back into the position it had taken him so many years to escape. And in that process, he increasingly realized that success was not the answer to the questions he had carried from the beginning. There were filming sessions where everything went perfectly. There were rounds of applause after each scene. There were praises from directors and colleagues. But when it all ended, the familiar feeling still returned, a light emptiness. Not enough to make him collapse, but enough to remind him that something had still not been resolved. He did not talk about it, did not share it with anyone, because he had gotten used to keeping everything inside. And perhaps he was not even sure that anyone could really understand it. In the eyes of the public, Laurence Fishburne had succeeded. He had memorable roles, prestigious awards, and an increasingly solid position in the film industry. But in his inner world, the journey continued as if it had never had a stopping point. He was still searching for a feeling that success could not bring, the feeling of belonging, the feeling of being accepted, not because of what he did, but because of who he was. And precisely that absence, that incompleteness, had become an inseparable part of who he was, a man who could stand in the light of the whole world, receiving thunderous applause, but still did not feel he truly belonged to the place where everyone believed he had conquered. Then came a moment when the whole world seemed to turn and look at Laurence Fishburne all at once, not as a talented actor still finding his place, but as an irreplaceable icon. When he stepped into the role of Morpheus in The Matrix, it was not just a successful performance, it was an almost complete transformation. Morpheus was not just a character, he was the embodiment of belief, of awakening, of a guide through a world full of illusions and chaos. And Laurence Fishburne, with his deep voice, his steady gaze, and the calm he had carried throughout his entire life, seemed not to need to act this character. He became it. Audiences did not just watch Morpheus, they believed in him. They saw in him someone who had the answers, someone who understood the truth, someone who could lead them through things they could not face on their own. But right from that moment, a new burden began to form, one that no one could see, because it was hidden behind the glare of success. When a person is seen by the whole world as a symbol of wisdom and guidance, they are no longer allowed to be an ordinary human being. Laurence Fishburne was not just an actor playing Morpheus. In the eyes of the public, he became Morpheus. Every word he spoke, every time he appeared, carried an invisible expectation that he must always be certain, always in control, always the one who never wavered. No one asked if he had moments of doubt, because in the story they believed, he was not the one asking questions. He was the one giving the answers. That pressure did not come in a single day. It built up through every glance, every interview, every time he stepped out in front of the public and realized that people no longer saw him as a separate individual. They saw him as a symbol. And a symbol is not allowed to get tired. A symbol is not allowed to be wrong. A symbol is not allowed to have moments of weakness that no one sees. Laurence understood that, not because someone told him, but because he felt it in the way the world reacted to him. And as he had done throughout his life, he adapted. He kept his calm, kept his words carrying weight, kept his image consistent with what people expected. But inside, things were not that simple. The success of The Matrix did not erase the questions he had carried from before it, only made them harder to acknowledge. Because when you have become the person others rely on, admitting that you also need a support becomes almost impossible. Laurence continued to work. continued to take on roles, continued to appear as a man who always knew what he was doing. But there were moments when the lights went out, when no one was watching, when he was still the person who had grown up in absence, still the one who had learned to endure on his own, still the one who was not sure he truly belonged where he stood. There is a paradox that few people notice. The role of Morpheus gave Laurence Fishburne a position he had never had before, but at the same time locked him into an image he could not easily escape. He became the standard for guiding characters, for those with depth, with calm, with weight. But that also meant he was rarely allowed to show other sides that were weaker, more vulnerable, more human. The industry began to see him in a specific way, and every role after that was cast in the shadow of Morpheus. He did not just need to act well, he needed to maintain an image. And while the world saw a man who had reached the peak, Laurence Fishburne continued to live in two parallel lives. One life where he was the guide, the one with the answers, the one who never wavered, and another life where he was still searching, still facing things with no solutions, still learning to accept that he was not perfect. The difference between those two lives was not always clear, but it was always there in the silences between words, in the glances that did not last too long, in the decisions he did not explain. No one said he had to be strong all the time, but everything around him made it true. No one forbade him from making mistakes, but the price of a mistake for someone in his position was always greater. And so he continued to move forward with caution, with control, with a clear awareness that everything he did was seen, judged, and remembered. It was not an easy life, but it was the life he had accepted. And perhaps the saddest thing was not that he had to carry that burden, but that he had grown used to it. It became a part of who he was, a part of how he existed in this world. Laurence Fishburne no longer questioned whether he could let go, because he had lived too long in the role the world had given him. He continued to be the person everyone trusted, the one they looked to when they needed an answer, the one they thought would never lose his way. But deep inside, there was still a part of him that knew even guides sometimes do not know where to go. From after he became a global icon, Laurence Fishburne's life gradually entered a state that not many people recognized. A divided existence, where two people coexisted but had never truly met. On screen, he was the guide. He was Morpheus. He was the characters who carried certainty and wisdom that others could trust completely. He spoke words with weight, made choices without hesitation, stood firm in situations where others collapsed. Every gesture, every look, every silence of his was understood as a sign of control, of knowing exactly where he was and where he was going. And the world believed it, not just in the movie theater, but in real life too. They looked at him as if he truly had the answers to things they could not understand. But outside the spotlight, when the roles ended and the lines were no longer there, another person emerged. Not the guide, but the one still searching, a man walking in the shadow of himself, carrying questions with no answers, empty spaces that could not be filled, and a weariness he never allowed himself to show. This contradiction did not explode, did not cause clear incidents, but existed quietly, stretching through each year, each role, each time he appeared in public. No one saw it because it was not allowed to show. Laurence had learned very early that the world does not wait for you to be ready, and once you have been placed in a certain position, holding that position is more important than anything else. So he continued. He continued to say the right things, continued to appear with that familiar calm, continued to play the role of someone who never wavered. And over time, the boundary between acting and existing became blurred once again. Not just on screen, but in his own life. He was also performing stability, performing control, performing a version of himself that the world could accept. No one asked how he was feeling, not because they did not care, but because they believed he did not need to be asked. In their eyes, he was the one asking questions, not the one needing answers. and that created an invisible distance between him and those around him, a distance not easy to notice, but large enough to make him always stand alone, even in the middle of a crowd. In interviews, he answered with calm, thinking carefully about every word, not revealing too much about himself. In conversations, he listened more than he spoke, observed more than he participated, not because he did not want to connect, but because he had grown used to holding back a part of himself as a way to protect something he could not name. There were long nights, when everything had gone quiet, when there were no more roles to hold on to, no more lights to hide behind, when Laurence had to face himself, the person with no script, no director, no audience. And in those moments, the difference between the two lives became clearer than ever. One side was the image the world trusted, the other was the person still trying to understand himself. But instead of trying to reconcile the two parts, he chose to continue living with both. Not because he did not recognize the contradiction, but because he saw no other way. And perhaps what makes this story so heavy is not that he had to live two lives, but that no one noticed it. No one stopped long enough to look into the silences, to ask what was behind that calm, to realize that a person could be very strong in one aspect, but very fragile in another. Laurence did not ask for that. He did not seek pity or understanding. But the absence of it still left a mark, a feeling of isolation that was not loud, not dramatic, but long-lasting and deep. He continued to live as if everything was okay, not because everything was truly okay, but because that was the only way he knew to keep going. He went to work, completed his roles, appeared when needed, and disappeared when no longer required. He kept his life neat, controlled, without letting the chaotic parts show on the outside. And over time, that became second nature, a way of existing that did not require thinking, a reflex formed from many years of living with things left unsaid. But deep inside, there was still a part of him that knew this balance was fragile, that the two people could not exist separately forever without consequences, that one day the postponed questions would come back, the suppressed emotions would find a way to surface. But that day had not come yet. Or if it had, he still had not allowed it to happen, because for Laurence Fishburne, continuing was not a choice, it was a necessity, and in the world he lived in, where he was the guide for others, there was no room to stop and ask whether he was heading in the right direction or not. Throughout the years when the world saw Laurence Fishburne as a symbol of steadfastness, he also quietly built a private life, a family that, from the outside, looked like a rare anchor amid all the relentless pressures. When he married Gina Torres, it was not just a connection between two people working in the same entertainment industry, but also a resonance between two strong, private personalities who understood the cost of fame. They were not a loud couple, did not appear with flashy stories, and did not need to prove anything to the media. And it was precisely that silence that made their relationship different, a family not built on public attention, but on private moments that few had the chance to see. In the early years, everything seemed stable in the way many people dream of. They worked together, understood the pressures the other faced, and shared a world that not everyone could step into. They had a child, built their own rhythm of life, and tried to keep the important things from being swept away by the whirlwind of their careers. For Laurence, it might have been the first time he felt he had a place to return to, a space where he did not need to act, where he could temporarily set aside the shell the world had placed on him. But even in that peace, things left unsaid still existed. Because a person who had grown used to keeping everything inside did not change easily just because the surrounding circumstances got better. Both of their careers continued to grow, and with that came increasingly packed schedules and longer periods of separation. There was no specific moment that marked the change, no clear incident that caused everything to crack. Instead, the distance appeared slowly, almost imperceptibly, in shorter conversations, in silences that lasted longer than usual, in things both thought but did not say. Laurence remained the calm man, still keeping everything under control, but that very control became a wall. He did not share much about what he was feeling, not because he did not trust, but because he was not used to doing so. And when one person does not speak, the other can only guess, and sometimes that guess never reaches the truth. Gina Torres, with her sensitivity, perhaps noticed those changes even before they became obvious. But noticing is not the same as being able to fix it. In a relationship, love is not always enough to fill the gaps each person carries from before. Laurence carried years of silence, of facing everything alone, of not allowing himself to be weak, and those things did not disappear when he entered marriage. They only changed the way they appeared, less obvious, but still present. There were times when he was physically beside his family, but his mind was elsewhere, pulled by pressures he could not share. There were moments when his presence was real, but the connection was not fully complete. From the outside, no one saw those cracks. They still looked like an admirable couple, still appeared together when necessary, still maintained the image the public expected. There were no public arguments, no clear signs of breakdown, and perhaps that was exactly what made everything harder to notice. When a relationship does not collapse loudly, but slowly loses what once held it together, cracks do not always start with big shocks. Sometimes they are just small, repeated distances until they become too large to bridge. Laurence continued to live as he had always lived, keeping everything inside, not letting personal difficulties affect his outer image. He still worked, still appeared with that familiar calm, still was the person the world trusted. But in private spaces, the things left unsaid began to accumulate. It was not blame, not clear disappointment, but a vague feeling that something was slowly drifting away, and no one really knew how to hold on to it. In a life where he had grown used to enduring on his own, sharing pain with others was not easy. And sometimes that very thing made the people closest to him become more distant. A family can be built with love, with respect, with shared efforts. But to maintain it, more is needed. Openness is needed. The willingness to face difficult things is needed. The permission to be weak in front of others is needed. And for Laurence Fishburne, that was something he had never truly learned. So even though he had built a family that many looked at with admiration, inside there were still gaps that no one could fill. And those gaps, over time, did not disappear. They only became deeper, quieter, until one day they became impossible to ignore. And then, in a moment that no script could prepare for, Laurence Fishburne's life stepped into an incident he could not control, could not edit, and could not act his way through an incident that came from the very place he had tried hardest to protect, his family. When the name Montana Fishburne, his daughter, suddenly appeared heavily in the headlines with controversial decisions, everything happened too fast, too loud, and too public to keep in the silence he usually maintained. The media did not see this story as a private pain, but as a topic to exploit, to analyze, to judge. The sensational headlines, the repeated articles asked a question no one could answer for him. A man once seen as a symbol of wisdom and control. Why could he not control his own family? In those days, the world no longer looked at Laurence Fishburne as an actor or an icon. They looked at him as a father, and not the father they expected. No one really cared about what he was going through inside. No one asked how he felt watching his daughters step onto a path he could not accept. Instead, everything revolved around the contrast between the image he had built for decades and the reality unfolding before their eyes. And that very contrast created a pressure no role could help him face. For the first time in his life, Laurence Fishburne was not the one guiding the story. He could not control the events, could not deliver the right line at the right time, could not end the scene when it became too much. He stood there in his own life, like a helpless observer, watching everything happen with no way to intervene fully. And for a person who had spent his entire life in control, holding steady, never showing any wavering, that feeling was not just difficult. It was a quiet collapse. He chose to react in the way he knew best: silence. There were no explanatory interviews, no long defenses, no effort to change how the media perceived the story. But this silence was not like before. It was no longer simply a protective shell. It became a void where the pain could spread without being stopped. Because this time, the issue was not how the world saw him, but how he saw himself. There was a question he could not avoid. Did everything he had built his career, his image, his values, really mean anything if he could not protect his own child from the choices she made? That was not a fair question, but it was the question he had to face. And in his silence, he did not try to answer it publicly. He kept it inside as he had done with so many other things in his life, but this time its weight was different. It was not just a personal pain, but a profound sense of failure, not in his role as an actor, but in his role as a father. And unlike professional failures, there was no way to reshoot the scene, no opportunity to fix things in a pre-written script. What had happened, and he had to live with it. There were nights when he was alone, with no camera, no lights, no one watching, and in those moments, everything he had tried to control began to surface, not as a clear collapse, but as a constant pressure weighing on every thought. He did not talk about it, did not share it, but it was there in the way he stayed silent longer than usual, in the way he avoided questions he knew would come, in the way he continued to live, as if everything was still okay, even though he knew it was not entirely true. The world kept moving. The media eventually moved on to other stories. But for Laurence Fishburne, that incident did not end when the news died down. It became a part of him, a part of the story he could never separate himself from. He continued to work, continued to appear, continued to maintain the image people had grown familiar with. But inside, something had changed. It was not weakness, but a crack, a sign that even the strongest people have limits they cannot overcome. And perhaps what made this moment the biggest breaking point in his life was not what had happened, but what he could not do. He could not stop it, could not fix it, could not make everything go back to the way it was before. For a person who had grown used to finding solutions, having no solution was the hardest thing to accept. And in that helplessness, Laurence Fishburne had to face a truth he had never wanted to admit, that there are battles, no matter how strong you are, that you still cannot win. After the shock that no role could have prepared him for, Laurence Fishburne stood before a choice with no right answer, a choice not on the red carpet, with no audience, no director yelling, "Cut," only a father, and what remained of the faith he had in himself. He could have stepped in, spoken louder, intervened more deeply, tried to pull everything back in the way the world expected a man like him to do. But he did not. He chose to keep his distance, not because he did not love his daughter, but because he understood that there are boundaries. Even love cannot cross without causing more harm. That decision did not come in one decisive moment. It formed through long nights, through repeated thoughts, through weighing the choice between holding on tight and letting go. And in the end, he let go, not because he wanted to, but because he believed it was the only thing left he could do. But letting go did not mean the pain stopped. On the contrary, it was a different kind of pain, dull, lingering, with no clear end. He continued to live, continued to work, continued to appear with the calm the world had grown familiar with, but inside there was a torment no one could see. On one side was the love of a father, the kind of affection that needs no conditions, no reasons, that simply exists. On the other side were principles, the things he believed were right, necessary, and non-negotiable. And between those two, there was no path that did not lead to loss. If he intervened, he might lose the very values he had held his entire life. If he did not intervene, he had to accept standing by from afar, watching things he could not change. Whichever way he chose, he had to pay a price. That inner conflict was not loud, did not show through dramatic actions. It lived in the silences, in the way he paused longer, when asked about his family, in the way he gently but firmly changed the subject, in the short answers that hid so many things left unsaid. He did not explain his choice to the public, did not try to make them understand, perhaps because he knew that some experiences can only be felt by those who go through them, and explaining would not make it lighter. But that did not mean he did not feel it. On the contrary, he felt it very clearly. He just did not let it come out. There were days when he wondered if he could have done things differently, if there was some way he had missed, some moment where if he had said one more thing, done one more thing, everything could have changed. Those questions had no answers, but they still came back, repeating as part of the pain he could not resolve. And it was in those moments that he had to face what he had never wanted to accept, that there are things in life that cannot be fixed, cannot be turned back, cannot be made whole the way we wish. He remained the man the world saw strong, in control, unwavering. But behind that image was a person learning to live with a wound that would not heal, not a wound that made him collapse, but one that changed him, making him look at everything with greater caution, with deeper silence. He no longer searched for answers to everything, because he had come to understand that not every question can be answered. And perhaps that was one of the hardest lessons he had to learn. Not how to fix things, but how to accept them. Time passed, but the pain did not disappear. It only changed form, becoming less sharp but deeper. It no longer appeared as a big wave, but as an undercurrent, always there, always affecting the way he saw the world, the way he saw himself. He continued to live with it, without trying to erase it, without trying to deny it, and in that acceptance, there was a loneliness that not everyone could understand, a loneliness that came from knowing that some parts of his life would forever remain incomplete. Laurence Fishburne did not talk about it. He did not need to, but in the way he existed, in the way he continued to move forward without revealing what was happening inside, people could sense that he had changed. Not weaker, but different, a man who had seen his own limits and still chose to continue. And perhaps that is what makes his story heavier than any tragedy that could be told in words. Not because of what happened, but because of what he had to carry afterward. Every day, in silence, with no ending. After everything that had happened, when the cracks in his personal life could no longer be covered by the familiar silence, Laurence Fishburne entered a phase where even the things that had once been anchors gradually moved away from him. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to leave an undeniable emptiness. His marriage to Gina Torres, which had been built on understanding and respect, finally came to an end. There were no public arguments, no accusations, no details exposed to the public. Everything happened in the way they had lived for many years, quietly, privately, and almost without leaving clear traces. But that very quietness made the separation even heavier, because when there is no noise, people easily mistake it for having no pain. There was no specific moment when everything fell apart. There was no single day they could look back on and say, "This is when it all changed." Instead, everything disintegrated in a slow, almost imperceptible way, like how the distance between two people can grow without anyone truly noticing until it becomes too large to bridge. Laurence and Gina, two people who had once understood each other in the pressures of the entertainment industry, who had once shared a life that not many could understand, ultimately could not keep that connection alive, not because of a lack of affection, but because the things left unsaid had accumulated for too long, the silences had become too deep, and the personal wounds each carried could no longer be healed simply by the other's presence. For Laurence, this was not just the end of a relationship, but another loss in the chain of things he had been unable to hold on to. He did not react with anger, did not try to place blame, did not attempt to change how the story was told on the outside. He accepted it in the way he had accepted many other things in his life, in silence. But that acceptance did not make the pain disappear. It only made it harder to notice. Hidden beneath the shell of calm he had grown familiar with, there were moments when he looked back, not to find fault, but to understand what had changed, what had been lost, and why two people who had once walked in the same direction gradually turned onto two different paths. A quiet breakup often leaves no clear memories to hold on to. There were no big fights to remember, no final decisive words. There was only absence. The absence of a person who had always been there. The absence of habits. The small moments that had once been taken for granted. And it was that very absence that created an emptiness not easy to fill. Laurence continued to live in the space that had once belonged to both of them, continued the routines that now only he carried out alone, and in every small detail he realized that something had truly ended. He did not talk about it with the public, did not turn it into a story to tell, but in the way he appeared, in the deeper quietness, in the distance he kept from the world, people could sense that he was carrying something heavier than before. It was not a collapse, but a change of realization that not everything important can be kept, no matter how hard you try. And for a person who had spent his entire life maintaining, controlling, and not letting anything slip from his hands, having to accept the loss of something important without being able to do anything to stop it, was a challenge no role could have helped him rehearse for. Perhaps the most painful thing was not that the marriage ended, but that it ended in a way that could not be fixed. There was no chance to redo it, no way to go back to the time when everything was still intact. And in that silence, Laurence Fishburne once again faced a truth he had experienced before, that some things in life are not a matter of effort, but a matter of limits. You can try, you can persist, you can believe, but you still cannot hold on to everything. He continued to move forward as he always had. He did not stop, did not look back too long, did not let the pain slow his steps. But that did not mean he was not carrying it with him. On the contrary, he carried it as a part of himself, as something inseparable. And in that continuation, there was a loneliness that did not need to be spoken, a loneliness that came from having once had something important, and now having to learn how to live without it. After all the losses that took place in silence, Laurence Fishburne did not disappear from the world, did not withdraw completely as many might have done. He still appeared, still worked, still stepped onto film sets with the familiar, calm as if everything continued in its natural way. When he joined the John Wick series, audiences once again saw the image they had grown familiar with, a powerful, mysterious man carrying absolute certainty and control. His character, the Bowery King, was not loud, not flashy, but had a weight of its own, a presence that simply appearing was enough to shape the space around him. And to the outside world, that seemed like proof that Laurence Fishburne was still Laurence Fishburne. Still strong, still steady, still unchanged. But the truth inside was not that simple. He still worked, but he was no longer the same person as before. Not because he had become weaker, but because he carried too many things no one could see. The personal incidents, the losses that could not be repaired, the increasingly clear empty spaces, all of them did not disappear just because he stepped into a new role. They went with him, quietly, as a part of the person he could not separate from. And in a way, work became the only place where he could temporarily set them down, not to resolve them, but to postpone them. On the film set, everything was clearer. There was a script, a character, a specific goal. There were lines that needed to be spoken, actions that needed to be performed, and a predetermined ending. It was a world Laurence understood, a world he could control, and that was exactly why he continued to work, not only for his career, but because it was the only way for him not to face directly what was happening inside. When he was in character, he did not need to be himself. He did not need to answer the questions life posed, did not need to confront the things he could not change. He only needed to act. And in that moment, that was enough. But when the scene ended, when the lights went out, when he returned to himself, everything that had been pushed aside came back, not loudly, not suddenly, but like a familiar presence he could not escape. He continued to live in two states, one person on screen and one person in real life. But the gap between those two states was no longer just a difference, it became a way to exist. He needed one part to cover the other, needed a role so he would not have to face himself. There were times when people looked at him and said he was still the same, still keeping his form, still having that appeal, still an actor they trusted. But what they did not see was that the change was not on the outside, but on the inside. Laurence Fishburne no longer sought anything from work the way he once had. He no longer chased recognition, no longer tried to prove himself to the world. He worked because it was what he knew, what he could do, what kept him moving forward. But the motivation had changed. It no longer came from desire, but from necessity. His life continued, but not whole in the way people usually think when they talk about success. He had a career, fame, roles many people dream of, but those things did not touch the deepest parts of who he was. The parts that had been affected by what he had been through, by the things he had lost, by the questions he still had not answered. And in that continuation, there was a vague feeling that he was living two parallel lives with no point of intersection. He did not talk about it, did not explain it, did not turn it into a story, but in the way he existed, in the increasingly deep silence, in the distance he kept from the world, people could sense that he was carrying something no role could replace. He still worked, still appeared, still was a part of the industry he had been tied to his entire life, but at the same time, he was also hiding himself, not to escape the world, but to keep the parts of himself he was not ready to share. And perhaps that is how Laurence Fishburne continued, not by overcoming everything that had happened, but by living with it. A life not completely whole, but still going on. A person no longer the same as before, but still standing firm. A journey with no clear ending, but still continuing day by day in silence the way he had always lived. After many years of walking between the light and the unnamed shadows, Laurence Fishburne gradually chose a different path, not disappearing completely, but withdrawing far enough that the noise of the world no longer touched him in the old way. He no longer appeared frequently, no longer joined long interviews, no longer sought constant presence in front of the public. His appearances became rarer, more selective, and always came with a distance he deliberately maintained, not because he no longer loved his work, but because he had come to understand that there were things more important than always being seen. After everything he had been through, stepping back was not a sign of weakness, but a way to protect what remained of himself. But there is one thing that Laurence Fishburne has never truly learned, and that is how to be weak. Not because he has not had those moments, but because he has never allowed them to exist long enough to be seen. From when he was a child, he understood that the world does not always wait for you to be ready, and if you do not stand firm, you will be left behind. That lesson followed him throughout his life, becoming a part of how he existed. But what was the price of it? It was having to carry everything alone, having no space to let go, having to keep going even when there was nothing left to hold on to. His legacy, therefore, does not lie only in cinema. It is not just the roles that people will still mention for many years to come, not just the moments on screen that audiences cannot forget. The real legacy of Laurence Fishburne lies in the way he has lived a life that is not perfect, not easy, but one that never gave up. He did not teach the world through lectures, but through his very existence, that strength is not about never feeling pain, but about continuing to move forward while carrying all the cracks inside. At the end of the journey, he no longer needs to prove anything more. He does not need to become a better version, does not need to repair what has passed, does not need to search for a completeness that perhaps never exists. He only needs to continue being himself, a person who has been through enough to understand that not every question has an answer, and not every wound needs to be healed in order to keep living. And perhaps, when the final lights go out, when the roles stop, when the world no longer sees him as an icon, what remains is not what he has achieved, but the way he stood firm through it all. A man who taught the whole world about strength, but never allowed himself to be weak. And it is precisely in that incompleteness that his story becomes truer, deeper, and more unforgettable than any role he has ever played. The story of Laurence Fishburne not only makes people admire him, but also leaves a very deep sadness, a sadness that comes from realizing that there are people who had to learn to be strong too early, to the point that they no longer know how to be weak. When looking back at his journey, from a child who grew up without his father's figure, stepping early into a harsh adult environment, to having to act, not only on screen but also in real life, we see clearly a thread running through it all. He was never allowed to stop and be protected. Even when he reached the peak with The Matrix and became a symbol of wisdom and guidance, inside him there still existed an emptiness that could not be filled. Something shone clearly through his personal incidents, especially the story with his daughter Montana Fishburne, when he had to choose to keep his distance in pain, or the marriage with Gina Torres that ended without any loud words. Those details are not scandals, but quiet cracks that help us understand that his strength lies not in never failing, but in continuing to live when he could not fix everything. For American society, a society that values individuality, success, and independence, this story is an important reminder that real strength is not only the ability to stand firm, but also the ability to acknowledge one's own limits and seek connection. No one should have to live two lives just to be accepted. And perhaps the biggest lesson from Laurence Fishburne is not how to become an icon, but a warning that even the strongest people need to be listened to be understood, and to be allowed to be weak like an ordinary human being. If the story of Laurence Fishburne makes you think, please hit subscribe and leave a heart. That is a small way to honor a man who has been strong for too long in silence. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the lives behind the lights that not everyone sees.